The intractable problem with the Voynich manuscript is, of course, that it's written in an unknown language, or else a cipher that the best cryptologists on the planet have not been able to unpick. I certainly have no solutions to those conundrums, but here I'd like to assemble a few notes on the problem. The secondary literature is vast and often technical. It's populated, moreover, by linguists and, even worse, paleographers, more recently computer analysts, armed with elaborate algorithms. But what does it all amount to so far? First, the script. It seems tantalisingly familiar, and yet we can find no other examples of it whatsoever. Not one. The familiarity is because it is mainly made up of things we recognise as Latin letters, Latin abbreviation marks and Arabic numerals. It's surely European with a Latin background. The fancy tall letters called gallows letters attract the most attention. Some can be identified from other sources where they appear as abbreviation marks or as combinations of other letters, mainly from the conventions of legal documents. In the Voynich manuscript, they've clearly been repurposed. But the scribe or scribes are perfectly adept with the script. The scribe is very practiced in it. It's very smooth. He's not struggling with an unfamiliar script. It's remarkable that there are no mistakes or corrections in the manuscript. The untrained eye can in fact identify at least two different scribes, two hands. Paleographers think there might have been as many as 5 or 8 scribes working on the document. They were all well trained in the script. Even if they were copying a pre-existing text, you would expect some mistakes and corrections. The text is very clean. There are, though, 2 distinct languages, or more likely dialects, dubbed Voynich A and Voynich B, or Currier A and Currier B, after Prescott Currier, the cryptologist who first observed this. The patterns of letters and words and the vocabulary falls into 2 groups, some pages and sections to one and some to the other, A or B. It's now common to label pages of the manuscript as being written in either A or B. The distinction between A and B is not absolute, however, but rather A seems to evolve into B with intermediate sections. Careful study of the patterns seem to show that A changes into B, not that they are 2 fixed, pre-existing sets of patterns. In any case, the language changes throughout the document, but follows 2 broad patterns, much as different dialects of a natural language do. The distribution of A and B is not random. The entire herbal section of the work is in Currier A. The nymph sections, the balneological bathing sections and the astrological sections and the star lists are in Currier B. Different dialects therefore go with different materials. Throughout the work, the illustrations appear to have been done first, with the addition of text anticipated. It is more common for illustrations to illustrate a text. The pictures serve the text. Here the pictures came first. It therefore makes sense to study the pictures in themselves and not to be too distracted by the text, although they surely go together. It is inconceivable that the text of this work is not about herbs. The hand of the scribe or scribes can be described as educated. We can identify it as the so-called humanist hand that developed in the Italian Renaissance, as opposed to earlier, more medieval and less modern hands. The scribe has had a humanist education. The materials of the artifact itself, the vellum and ink plus the humanist hand, places the work in northern Italy in the first half of the Quattrocento. and the alpine herbs make it an alpine text from that region. There is assorted marginalia here and there in the text, but most of it seems to have been added later, except perhaps for a few stray German words. There is no punctuation, unless letters can also serve as punctuation marks. The text is arranged in paragraphs, and paragraphs often begin with gallo letters that seem to act as pilcrows, that is, a punctuation mark indicating the beginning of a new paragraph. Pages have distinct topics, and so the page is a meaningful unit. A page is a distinct unit of information. Paragraphs do not extend across pages. But remarkably, the line seems to be a meaningful unit as well. Currier first noted this too. There seem to be rules about which words and letters end lines. This happens in poetry, but not in prose. The Voynich looks like prose, but the text is actually structured by lines, as if poetry is being written in blocks of prose. Although there are a few sections that visually seem set out like poems or songs. There is a great deal of textual repetition. Letter combinations are unusually predictable, more so than in natural languages, but by other indications its behaviour is within the range of natural tongues. It is an aberration, but not so weird that it can't be natural, or be an encoding of some natural language. The underlying plain text is likely to be a natural language rather than gibberish or a concocted language, despite what some defeatists might say. Among languages, the underlying language is very likely to be European, just on the basis of context, and the script might suggest a Latinate Romance language, although a wide range of European languages used Roman script, and the peculiarities of the text might be better explained if the plain text is exotic, such as if Arabic or Hebrew or Persian or some Eastern language is being rendered into a Latin-based alphabet made for the purpose. Some statistical analysis of the text suggests it behaves a bit like an abjad, an alphabet of consonants without vowels. All attempts to identify the underlying language have so far been unconvincing. People have tried French, Spanish, Ukrainian, Flemish, various Slavic tongues, Manchurian, Hawaiian. Nothing fits. Or is it a language that's now extinct? Linguistic analysis of the text looks scientific, but is actually fraught with problems. The field is now awash with linguists mesmerised by their computers. But there's no agreed transcription of the text. Where exactly does one word end and another begin? Many letters are uncertain. Errors at this level foul up our data. People run computer studies, but what if, for instance, the various single letters are not words but act as punctuation or serve some other purpose? Suddenly, word counts and statistics and graphs and such will be wildly wrong. I'm not confident anyway of the results of many published studies along these lines. It's always a case with computers, garbage in, garbage out. It depends upon the data fed into the computer. Paleographic studies too are less reliable than they seem. Judging handwriting is an inherently subjective study. Paleography is not far removed from palmistry. If there are 5 or more scribes involved, then we have a team or a school or a workshop, and we must explain 5 or more scribes thoroughly trained in this strange script to a point of fluency and familiarity such that they make no mistakes. Was the author of the work also the scribe, or just the illustrator who then employed a workshop of scribes, a workshop that happened to be extremely proficient in this unique language and script. The problems are compounding. Quite possibly we are trying to read an unknown language that has been encoded using an unknown cipher. If it's a cipher, it defies the best cryptologists. It is certainly not a known type of code. It is not clear that it's a code at all, or else we just lack the key and will never be able to break it. There are some who think the whole problem has been the cryptologist from the beginning. They've assumed that it's a code, but perhaps it's not, and the answers are linguistic rather than cryptological. The most common approach is to suspect that the underlying text is some iteration of Vulgar Latin. Rather than encoded, the text is perhaps shorthand or else phonetic. There are many possibilities other than it being a clever cipher. Cryptologists are a vain bunch. When confronted by a text they can't decode, they assume it must be devised by a genius. This happened from the outset. Their logic went, this book is in code, we can't crack the code, therefore it must have been written by Leonardo da Vinci, or Roger Bacon, or some other early modern luminary. But this goes against the style and character of the illustrations, which are best described as folkish. Can a super sophisticated world-beating cipher go hand in hand with such crude drawings? Against cipher theories is its length. It's over 200 pages. There are virtually no other known texts of that period and beyond where an entire book is written in a cipher. Almost always only portions of a text are encoded. If the Voynich manuscript is an entire book of that length written in code, that is extremely unusual. These problems, I think, should be tackled from three directions at once. There's the text, the context, and the subtext. The subtext concerns the questions: why has the author done this? Why create a unique script? Why use this language? If it's encoded, why encode it? What provoked the author to create this work in this form and with the language that it has? And for whom? For what readership? We can say a private readership. It's not being prepared for publication. It's a private work, an eccentric work, an idiosyncratic work for one reader or for a small readership, not a big readership, we can be sure. Some of the quirky illustrations seem to be in-jokes. A private work might be encoded, or it might be in an invented language known only to a few. There are invented languages in the Middle Ages and even more in the Renaissance, typically purporting to be supernatural. The famous example was Hildegard of Bingen's Language of Fire, a Language of Angels. And one of the luminaries often connected quite wrongly to the Voynich text, John Dee, purported to do the same, the so-called angelic language of Enoch. But again, an entire book of this length in an invented language would seem unlikely and would require linguistic skills that don't match the low calibre of the illustrations. For all of that, I'm inclined to refer to Voynichese as the language of the nymphs. I think it's more likely to be the language of the nymphs than it is to be an encoding of the periodic table or the dimensions of the spiral nebula by Leonardo da Vinci 400 years ahead of his time. I'm inclined to think that the language goes with the folkish pictures, which is an assumption, I know, but I think it's a safe one, and that the answers to the riddles posed by the text are likely to be what we call ethno-linguistic. Motives? Perhaps it's a preservation document. Someone wants to preserve a body of herbal lore, but why does it require a private language? Regarding context, a North Italian early Quattrocento provenance places us, unfortunately, in a language soup. Both region and period are complicated crossroads. The linguistic context of northern Italy in the 1400s is a very complex one. The Alpine parts are a region that is a borderland between the Germanic north and the Latinate south, the ancient north-south road. It is mountainous terrain that historically has left many language communities isolated. It might help to take a brief tour of this linguistic background. The very earliest linguistic layers of the region that persist are probably Celtic, then Etruscan, then after that Latin. It is reported that colonies of retired Roman soldiers were often given grants of land in the region and settled in valleys. They spoke a vulgar Latin. This has persisted in the region to this day and created various minor and often very local languages along the way. We know of numerous languages from that area that are now extinct, and today others are regarded as threatened. There are some languages in that region with ancient Latin roots only spoken in 3 or 4 towns or villages. As a borderland, it has been subject to many intrusions. The important linguistic dynamic is created by the southward intrusion of Germanic languages from time to time and over time. Today, this part of Italy, the Südtirol, is majority German-speaking. It is not a recent eventuality either. The linguistic history of the region is the history of its gradual Germanisation. It remains an issue. Communities of minority languages, such as the Ladin speakers, accuse the German speakers of Germanisation and of trying to suppress or eradicate other tongues. It is a linguistic battleground and has been since the Middle Ages. In this respect, if our manuscript is from the early 1400s, it's an important turn of events would be in 1364. This was the year that the region came under the rule of the Habsburgs. In the following period, the Germanisation of the area greatly accelerated. Colonies of German speakers settled in the region in considerable numbers for the first time. Prior to that, the region had been Germanised only slowly by the Counts of Tyrol. Officially, it was an Italian bishopric, but in fact, the Counts of Tyrol controlled the region and Germanised it over time. When the Habsburgs took over from the Counts of Tyrol, 1364, the pretense of Italian control was dropped and the region was actively settled as Germanic land from that point on. In that and the next generation, therefore, we had a meeting and a clash between Germanic languages from the north and the historic and ancestral languages based in Latin in various iterations from the south. Arguably, this is the sort of situation in which linguistic aberrations might occur. In such borderlands you get pidgin, for example. People invent transitional languages. Miners in the Middle Ages, for instance, invented pidgin languages only spoken down the mines, so that miners of different tongues from different lands could communicate with each other. They were strange, pidginized hybrid languages that came and went as required. This is to say nothing of the learned and cosmopolitan linguistic environment of the cities of the region in that period, in the March of Verona. Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, Greek were academic languages in northern Italian universities, and a wide assortment of trading languages were current too. Moreover, this was a time when intellectuals in Italy were developing an interest in ciphers, codes and secret languages and the like. The heyday of such things was to be a century later, but they were current and not unknown in this context. It's not an academic tome, the Voynich. The scribe or scribes have a humanist hand. The script perhaps depends upon legal Latin notation, but there's no explicit sign of classical learning. If we had the cartoonish pictures alone, we might think it preserves a folk tradition of herbalism rather than making a contribution to the professional herbal medicine found in the schools of the times. The possibilities are perhaps so diverse that all of this is unhelpful, but it still gives the problem some shape. Text, context, and subtext. A solution to the problem will explain all three seamlessly, and in searching for a solution, all three can illuminate the others. Studies of the text alone, it must be said, have been extraordinarily unfruitful so far. If, after a century of study, the expert still cannot read a word of it and cannot decide if it's a cipher, a language, or gibberish, then perhaps the limitations are in our methods and assumptions. This is the point at which academics start putting out applications for research grants about an interdisciplinary approach. The best conundrums are humbling. The text of the Voynich manuscript looks so inviting. It looks as though we should be able to read it. But so far, not a word.